Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she pulled her 18-wheeler into the truck stop just outside Phoenix, Arizona. The desert sun was brutal that August afternoon, and her air conditioning had been acting up for the past 100 miles. She had been driving trucks for 12 years now, ever since her husband died in a construction accident and left her with 2 young kids to raise alone. At 38 years old, Sarah was tougher than most people gave her credit for. Standing 5 feet 6 inches tall with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, she looked like someone who had worked hard her entire life. Her black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same uniform every day: faded jeans, steel-toed boots, and whatever flannel shirt was clean. The truck stop was busy with the usual afternoon crowd. Sarah parked her rig carefully between 2 other trucks and climbed down from the cab. Her back ached from sitting for 6 straight hours, and her stomach was growling loudly. She had been hauling furniture from Los Angeles to Dallas, and this was her planned rest stop before the final push through New Mexico as she walked toward the diner. Sarah noticed 3 men standing near a beat-up pickup truck. They were drinking beer from bottles wrapped in brown paper bags, even though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. The men looked to be in their 20s, wearing dirty t-shirts and baseball caps. One of them had tattoos covering both arms, another was extremely overweight, and the third kept spitting tobacco juice onto the ground. Sarah had learned to recognize trouble over her years on the road. These men had that look in their eyes that spelled problems for anyone who crossed their path. She decided to ignore them completely and just get her meal and fuel as quickly as possible. The diner was cool and comfortable inside. Sarah chose a booth near the back where she could keep an eye on her truck through the window. She ordered her usual road meal: a cheeseburger, fries, and black coffee. The waitress was friendly, an older woman named Betty who had probably been working truck stops for decades. While waiting for her food, Sarah called her teenage daughter Emma back home in Tucson. Emma was staying with Sarah's sister during the summer while Sarah worked extra routes to save money for Emma's college fund. The conversation was brief, but warm. Emma was doing well in her summer job at a local bookstore and had been accepted to Arizona State University for the fall semester. After hanging up, Sarah felt that familiar mix of pride and worry that came with being a single mother. She was proud of how well Emma was doing, but worried constantly about providing enough support and guidance from the road. Trucking paid well, but it meant being away from home for days or sometimes weeks at a time. Her food arrived, and Sarah ate quickly while reviewing her logbook and planning the rest of her route. She would need to fuel up, check her tires, and then drive until midnight to stay on schedule. The delivery in Dallas was time-sensitive, and her reputation for reliability had earned her the better-paying routes. As she finished eating, Sarah noticed through the window that the 3 men from earlier were now standing closer to her truck. One of them was walking around it slowly, looking at the license plates and peering into the cab. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. In 12 years of trucking, she had dealt with her share of difficult people, but something about these particular men made her very uncomfortable. She paid her bill quickly and headed outside, hoping the men would move along once they saw her coming. The afternoon heat hit her like a wall as she stepped out of the air-conditioned diner. The parking lot was quieter now, with several trucks having moved on while she was eating. The 3 men were still near her truck when she approached. As she got closer, she could hear them talking loudly and laughing in a way that made her skin crawl. The one with tattoos noticed her first and nudged his friends. All 3 turned to look at her with expressions that made Sarah's heart start beating faster. She had learned over the years that confidence was often the best defense in situations like this. Sarah walked straight toward her truck with her head up and her shoulders back, hoping they would simply get out of her way. She had her truck keys ready in her hand and was mentally rehearsing the quickest way to get into the cab and lock the doors. But as she reached her truck, the tattooed man stepped directly into her path. His breath smelled like beer and cigarettes, and his eyes had a mean glint that Sarah had seen before in troublemakers. The other 2 men moved to flank her on either side, effectively trapping her between them and her truck. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah found herself in exactly the kind of situation she had always hoped to avoid. The tattooed man smiled in a way that made Sarah's blood run cold. His name was Jake, though Sarah didn't know this yet. He had been in and out of jail for the past 5 years on various charges, including assault, theft, and public intoxication. His two friends, Bobby and Chris, were equally bad news. Bobby was the overweight one who had been drinking since noon. And Chris was the youngest at 22, but already had a lengthy criminal record. Well, what do we have here? Jake said, blocking Sarah's path to her truck door. A lady truck driver. That's something you don't see every day around these parts. Sarah kept her voice steady and calm. Excuse me, I need to get to my truck. She tried to step around Jake, but he moved to block her again. Bobby and Chris were grinning like this was the most entertaining thing they had seen all day. Now hold on there, sweetheart, Jake continued. We were just admiring your rig here. That's a mighty fine truck you got. It must be worth a lot of money. His eyes were scanning Sarah up and down in a way that made her feel sick to her stomach. Sarah had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this felt different. These men weren't just being rude or making inappropriate comments. There was something more dangerous in their attitude, something that suggested they were planning to do more than just talk. I don't want any trouble, Sarah said firmly. I just need to get on the road. She kept her keys gripped tightly in her hand, ready to use them as a weapon if necessary. Her father had taught her basic self-defense when she first started trucking, but she had never actually had to use it. Bobby, the heavyset man, laughed and took a step closer. Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly. He reeked of beer and body odor. Maybe you could show us around inside that big truck of yours. I bet it's real nice in there. Chris, the youngest, was standing behind Sarah now, effectively cutting off her escape route. Yeah, we've never been inside one of those big rigs before. Come on, lady. Don't be so unfriendly. Sarah's mind was racing. The truck stop wasn't completely deserted, but it was much quieter than when she had arrived. Most of the other truckers had moved on, and the few remaining people were inside the diner or the convenience store. She could try to scream for help, but she wasn't sure anyone would hear her or respond quickly enough.
Look, guys, I really need to go,
Sarah said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. I have a delivery deadline to meet. She attempted once more to move toward her truck door, but Jake grabbed her arm roughly. I don't think you're listening to us, Lady Jake said, his grip tightening on her arm. We asked you nicely to show us your truck. Now we're not asking anymore. That's when Sarah knew she was in real danger. These men weren't just drunk troublemakers looking to hassle a female trucker. They had something much worse in mind. They weren't going to let her simply walk away. Sarah had learned some hard lessons during her years on the road. She had dealt with aggressive customers, dishonest mechanics, and plenty of men who thought they could intimidate her just because she was a woman in a male-dominated profession. But she had also learned that sometimes you had to stand up for yourself, even when you were scared. Let go of my arm, Sarah said in a voice that was much calmer than she felt inside. Right now. Jake laughed and squeezed harder. Or what? What are you going to do about it, truck lady? Sarah looked around quickly. There was a security camera mounted on a pole about 20 feet away, but she doubted it would deter these men. The nearest building was the diner, but it might as well have been a mile away with these three blocking her path. Bobby moved even closer, and Sarah could feel his hot breath on her neck. Come on, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just want to have a little fun. That's when Sarah made her decision. She had spent 12 years learning to handle 18-wheelers weighing up to 40 tons. She had changed tires in thunderstorms, navigated mountain passes in snowstorms, and backed trailers into loading docks that seemed impossible to reach. She had raised 2 children on her own while working one of the most demanding jobs in America. She was not going to let 3 drunk losers intimidate her in a truck stop parking lot. Sarah jerked her arm free from Jake's grasp with more force than he expected. I told you to let go, she said, her voice now carrying a warning edge that made Jake take a small step back. But the confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Jake's face twisted with anger when Sarah pulled free from his grip. He wasn't used to people, especially women, standing up to him. His pride was hurt, and with his friends watching, he felt like he had to prove himself. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten him in trouble with the law so many times before.
No.
You think you're tough, don't you? Jake snarled, moving closer to Sarah again. Let me tell you something, lady. This ain't some fancy city where people are going to help you. Out here, it's just us. Sarah's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She had learned from experience that showing fear to bullies only made them more aggressive. Her father had taught her that lesson when she was young, and it had served her well in the trucking industry. I'm not looking for trouble, Sarah repeated, but her voice was stronger now. Just move out of my way and let me get to my truck. Bobby laughed nastily and moved to stand directly behind Sarah. You hear that, boys? She's giving us orders now. I think this lady needs to learn some manners. Chris, who had been mostly quiet up to this point, suddenly spoke up. Maybe we should teach her how things work around here. His voice had a cruel edge that made Sarah realize. These men had probably done this kind of thing before. Sarah quickly assessed her situation. She was surrounded by 3 men who were bigger than her and clearly had bad intentions. The truck stop was relatively isolated and help seemed far away. But she also noticed something that gave her a small advantage. All 3 men had been drinking, and their movements were slightly unsteady. Sarah had grown up with 2 older brothers, who had taught her how to fight when necessary. She had also taken some self-defense classes when she first started trucking. Most importantly, 12 years of physical labor had made her stronger than most people realized. Loading and unloading cargo, securing tie-downs, and climbing in and out of truck cabs had built real strength in her arms and shoulders. Jake reached out to grab Sarah's arm again, but this time she was ready for him. She stepped back quickly and raised her hands in a defensive position. Don't touch me again, she warned. Or what? Jake sneered. You gonna fight all 3 of us? That's when Bobby made a crucial mistake. He was standing behind Sarah and decided to grab her from behind, probably thinking he could hold her while Jake and Chris did whatever they were planning to do. But Bobby had underestimated both Sarah's awareness and her reflexes. The moment Sarah felt Bobby's hands on her shoulders, she reacted instinctively. She drove her right elbow back as hard as she could, catching Bobby directly in his soft stomach. The blow knocked the wind out of him and sent him staggering backward. Gasping for air, Jake was so surprised by Sarah's quick response that he hesitated for just a moment. That hesitation cost him dearly. Sarah spun around and brought her knee up toward Jake's midsection. He managed to turn slightly, so the blow caught him in the hip instead of somewhere more painful. But it was still hard enough to make him stumble. Chris, the youngest of the 3, was the first to recover from his shock. He lunged at Sarah from the side, trying to tackle her to the ground. But Sarah had seen him coming and managed to sidestep at the last second. Chris went sprawling past her and landed hard on the asphalt, scraping his hands and knees. For a moment, all 4 people stood there breathing hard and staring at each other. The 3 men were clearly surprised that this woman trucker had just fought back successfully against all of them. Sarah was surprised too, but also felt a surge of confidence. She had proven to herself that she could defend herself when necessary, but the confrontation was far from over. In fact, Sarah's successful defense had only made the 3 men angrier and more determined to prove their dominance. Jake's face was red with rage and embarrassment. He couldn't believe that a woman had just made him and his friends look like fools. You're going to pay for that? Jake growled, wiping blood from a small cut on his lip where Sarah's knee had connected. Nobody does that to us and gets away with it. Bobby was still trying to catch his breath, holding his stomach and glaring at Sarah with pure hatred. Chris had gotten back to his feet and was examining the scrapes on his palms. All 3 men now had the look of people who had moved beyond trying to intimidate someone and were ready to actually hurt them. Sarah realized that her situation had just become much more dangerous. She had successfully defended herself for the moment. But now these men were truly angry and would probably use even more force in their next attack. She needed to find a way out of this situation quickly. Before things escalated even further, the afternoon sun continued to beat down on the truck stop parking lot as Sarah faced the 3 men who were now circling her like predators. The 3 men began to spread out in a wider circle around Sarah, clearly planning to attack her from multiple directions at once. Jake was rubbing his hip where Sarah's knee had connected, his eyes filled with rage. Bobby had finally caught his breath and was flexing his hands, preparing to grab her again. Chris was the most visibly angry. With blood seeping from the scrapes on his palms where he had hit the asphalt, Sarah knew she was in serious trouble. Fighting off one attacker was difficult enough, but 3 men working together would be nearly impossible to handle. She needed to think fast and use every advantage she could find. Her eyes quickly scanned the area around her, looking for anything that might help. The truck stop was still relatively quiet. A few cars were parked near the convenience store, and she could see people moving around inside the brightly lit building. But they were at least 100 yards away, too far to reach before these men would catch her. Her truck was only about 10 feet away, but Jake was positioned directly between her and the driver's side door. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, don't you?" Jake taunted, moving closer with his fists clenched. "Let's see how tough you are when we're not playing around anymore." Sarah's mind raced back to her self-defense training. Her instructor had always emphasized that when facing multiple attackers, the key was to avoid being surrounded and to take out the most aggressive opponent first. Jake was clearly the leader and the most dangerous, but he was also the most confident, which might make him careless. Bobby started moving toward Sarah's left side, while Chris approached from her right. They were trying to coordinate their attack, probably planning to grab her arms while Jake hit her. Sarah realized she had only seconds before they would be in position. That's when Sarah remembered something important. She wasn't just any woman being attacked by 3 men. She was a trucker who had spent 12 years learning to handle dangerous situations on the road. She had dealt with blown tires at 60 miles per hour, brake failures on mountain grades, and equipment malfunctions in the middle of nowhere. She had learned to stay calm under pressure and think clearly when things went wrong. More importantly, she was carrying something that these men probably hadn't noticed. Clipped to her belt was a heavy flashlight, the kind that truckers use for nighttime inspections. It was made of solid aluminum and weighed almost 2 pounds. In the right hands, it could be a very effective weapon. As Bobby and Chris moved closer, Sarah made her decision. Instead of waiting for them to attack her, she would go on the offensive. She unclipped the flashlight from her belt with her right hand while pulling her truck keys out with her left hand. Holding them so that the keys protruded between her fingers, Jake saw the flashlight and laughed. "What are you going to do with that? Blind us to death?" That laugh was Jake's second big mistake. Sarah had learned from her father that when someone underestimated you, that was your best opportunity to strike. She feinted toward Bobby on her left, causing him to react and move in that direction. Then she quickly pivoted and swung the heavy flashlight with all her strength. Jake's head. Jake was so focused on taunting Sarah that he didn't see the flashlight coming until it was too late. The aluminum tube caught him just above his left ear with a sickening crack. Jake's eyes rolled back in his head, and he dropped to the asphalt like a sack of grain, blood immediately beginning to pool under his head. Bobby and Chris both froze for a moment, staring in shock at their unconscious friend. They had expected to be the ones dealing out violence, not receiving it. The sight of Jake lying motionless on the ground with blood in his hair was not what they had planned for this afternoon. Sarah didn't give them time to recover from their shock. While they were staring at Jake, she turned toward Bobby and drove the keys in her left hand toward his face. The sharp metal scraped across his cheek, leaving for parallel cuts that immediately began to bleed. Bobby screamed and grabbed his face. Stumbling backward and tripping over his own feet, he landed hard on his rear end, blood running between his fingers as he tried to cover the cuts on his cheek. That left only Chris, and he was backing away from Sarah with his hands raised in front of him. The young man's courage had completely evaporated when he saw what Sarah had done to his 2 friends. Jake was lying unconscious in a pool of blood, and Bobby was sitting on the ground crying and holding his slashed face. "Hey, lady, take it easy," Chris said, his voice shaking. "We were just messing around. We didn't mean nothing by it." Sarah stood over Jake's unconscious form, still holding the bloody flashlight in her right hand. Her chest was heaving from exertion and adrenaline, but her eyes were cold and focused. She looked nothing like the woman who had walked out of the diner just a few minutes earlier. "You picked the wrong trucker to mess with," Sarah said in a voice that was quiet but filled with steel. Chris continued backing away from Sarah, his eyes wide with fear as he looked at his 2 injured friends. Jake was still unconscious on the asphalt, a dark pool of blood growing larger under his head. Bobby was rocking back and forth while holding his slashed face, making whimpering sounds that didn't seem to come from a grown man. "Please, lady," Chris begged, his voice cracking. "Don't hurt me. I'll leave right now, I swear. We won't bother you anymore." Sarah kept the flashlight raised and ready, but she was studying Chris carefully. He was the youngest of the three and seemed genuinely terrified by what had just happened. Unlike Jake and Bobby, Chris appeared to realize that they had made a serious mistake in targeting her. "You should have thought about that before you decided to surround me," Sarah said coldly. "What exactly did you three think was going to happen here?" Chris stumbled over his words as he tried to answer. "We were just... Jake said we should. Look, it wasn't my idea, okay? Jake and Bobby, they do this kind of stuff all the time. I just went along with it." Sarah felt a surge of disgust at Chris's words. These men had clearly done this before, probably to other women who hadn't been able to defend themselves. The thought of how many victims they might have hurt over the years made her even angrier. "So this wasn't the first time," Sarah stated rather than asked. "How many other women have you three attacked?" Chris's face went pale as he realized he had just admitted to being part of a pattern of violence. No, it's not like that. We never really hurt anybody. We just, scared them a little." "Scared them into what?" Sarah demanded, taking a step closer to Chris. The young man immediately stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Before Chris could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Betty, the waitress from the diner, was hurrying across the parking lot with a concerned expression on her face. Behind her were two other truck drivers who had apparently heard the commotion from inside the restaurant. Betty called out as she approached. Then she saw Jake lying unconscious in the blood and Bobby sitting on the ground holding his face. Her hand flew to her mouth in shock. "Call 911, Sarah told Betty without taking her eyes off Chris. "These three men attacked me, and I defended myself." One of the truck drivers, a large man with a gray beard, immediately pulled out his cell phone and started dialing. The other driver, a younger man with muscular arms covered in tattoos, positioned himself near Chris to make sure he didn't try to run away. "Are you okay, honey?" Betty asked Sarah with genuine concern. "Did they hurt you?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm fine. But this one," she pointed at Jake with her flashlight, "needs an ambulance. And that one," she indicated Bobby, "needs medical attention for his face." Bobby was still crying and holding his cheek where Sarah's keys had cut him. Blood was seeping through his fingers and dripping onto his shirt. "She attacked us," he whined to Betty. "We weren't doing nothing and she just went crazy." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger at Bobby's lie. "You grabbed me, surrounded me, and threatened me. I have every right to defend myself." The bearded truck driver who had called 911 hung up his phone. "Ambulance and police are on the way," he reported. "Should be here in about 10 minutes." He looked down at Jake's unconscious form with professional interest. "That's a pretty good crack to the skull. You might have given him a concussion," good Sarah replied without any trace of sympathy. "Maybe next time he'll think twice before attacking women." Betty was looking back and forth between Sarah and the three injured men, trying to piece together what had happened. As a truck stop waitress, she had seen plenty of fights and confrontations over the years. But this scene was more serious than most. "These boys were drinking all afternoon," Betty told Sarah. "I saw them in the parking lot earlier, and they were making crude comments about some of the female customers. I should have called the police then." Chris was still standing with his hands raised, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The tattooed truck driver was keeping a close eye on him, making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere until the police arrived. "What's your name, son?" the bearded driver asked Chris. "Chris," he answered quietly. "Chris Thompson." "Oh, Chris Thompson? You and your friends picked the wrong woman to mess with today," the driver said with a slight smile. "This lady knows how to take care of herself." Sarah was starting to come down from her adrenaline high, and she could feel her hands beginning to shake slightly. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. She had seriously injured two men, possibly giving one of them a life-threatening head injury. Even though she had been defending herself, she knew there would be consequences and investigations to deal with. In the distance, they could hear the wail of sirens getting closer. The first police car arrived within 8 minutes, followed closely by an ambulance and a second patrol car. The officers quickly took control of the scene, separating everyone involved and beginning to gather statements about what had happened. Officer Maria Rodriguez was the first to approach Sarah. She was a veteran police officer who had worked these highways for 15 years and had seen every kind of road incident imaginable. She took one look at the scene: Jake, unconscious and bleeding, Bobby holding his slashed face, Chris standing with his hands up, and Sarah holding a bloody flashlight, and immediately understood the basic situation. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Rodriguez. Are you injured?" she asked Sarah in a professional but kind voice. "No, I'm not hurt," Sarah replied. "These three men surrounded me and threatened me. One of them grabbed my arm and wouldn't let go. I defended myself." Officer Rodriguez nodded and made notes in her notepad. "I'm going to need to take your statement. But first, let's get the paramedics to check you out, just to be safe," while the paramedics examined Sarah for any injuries. She watched as the other emergency responders worked on Jake and Bobby. Jake was still unconscious, and the paramedics were very concerned about his head injury. They carefully placed him on a backboard and loaded him into the ambulance, talking in urgent voices about potential brain trauma and the need to get him to the hospital immediately. Bobby was conscious, but in significant pain from the cuts on his face. The paramedics cleaned and bandaged his wounds while a police officer took his statement. Bobby continued to claim that Sarah had attacked them without provocation, but his story kept changing as he tried to make himself look like the victim. Chris, meanwhile, was being questioned by the second police officer. Unlike Bobby, Chris seemed to understand that lying to the police would only make his situation worse. He was being more honest about what had actually happened, admitting that they had been drinking and had approached Sarah with bad intentions. Betty, the waitress, was also giving her statement to the officers, describing how she had seen the three men drinking in the parking lot all afternoon and making inappropriate comments about female customers. Her testimony was crucial in establishing the pattern of behavior that had led to the confrontation. The two truck drivers who had witnessed the aftermath were also interviewed. They confirmed that when they arrived, Sarah was clearly defending herself against multiple attackers, and that her actions appeared to be justified self-defense. After about 30 minutes, Officer Rodriguez returned to Sarah with her notepad ready. "Okay, Ms. Martinez, I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." Sarah took a deep breath and began her story. She described how she had noticed the three men drinking when she first arrived, how she had tried to avoid them, and how they had surrounded her when she tried to get to her truck. She explained how Jake had grabbed her arm and refused to let her go, how Bobby had tried to grab her from behind, and how Chris had blocked her escape route. "I didn't want to fight them," Sarah emphasized. "I just wanted to get to my truck and leave, but they wouldn't let me go, and they made it clear they were planning to do something terrible to me." Officer Rodriguez listened carefully and asked detailed questions about the sequence of events. She was particularly interested in who had made physical contact first, and whether Sarah had felt that her life was in danger. "When Jake grabbed my arm and Bobby tried to grab me from behind, I knew I was in serious trouble," Sarah explained. "These weren't just drunk guys being obnoxious. They were coordinating an attack, and I was afraid they were going to drag me somewhere private and hurt me badly." The officer nodded understandingly. As a female police officer, she had investigated many cases of violence against women and knew the signs of predatory behavior when she saw them. After another hour of investigation, the police had a clear picture of what had happened. The security camera footage from the truck stop confirmed Sarah's version of events, showing the three men surrounding her and Jake grabbing her arm before she fought back. Officer Rodriguez returned to Sarah with the results of the investigation. "Ms. Martinez, based on the evidence and witness statements, it's clear that you were acting in self-defense. You're free to go, but I'll need you to stay in contact in case we need additional information for the charges against these men." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been worried that she might be arrested along with her attackers, despite being the victim. "What's going to happen to them?" she asked. "Chris Thompson is being charged with assault and conspiracy. Bobby Williams is being charged with assault, battery, and conspiracy. As for Jake Morrison, Officer Rodriguez paused and checked her notepad. He's being taken to the hospital with a serious head injury. Depending on his condition, he could face additional charges, including attempted kidnapping. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. She was glad that her attackers would face consequences for their actions. But she also felt troubled by the severity of Jake's injury. Even though he had threatened and attacked her, she hadn't intended to hurt him so badly. "Will he be okay?" Sarah asked quietly. Officer Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "The paramedics think he'll survive, but he's going to have a long recovery ahead of him. You did what you had to do to protect yourself, Ms. Martinez. Don't feel guilty about that." 3 hours after the confrontation began, Sarah was finally able to get back on the road. The police had finished their investigation. The ambulances had taken Jake and Bobby to the hospital, and Chris had been arrested and taken to jail. Sarah's truck had been examined as part of the crime scene, but it was cleared for her to continue her journey before leaving the truck stop. Sarah called her daughter Emma to let her know what had happened. She didn't want Emma to hear about it from news reports or social media before hearing it directly from her mother. Emma asked with obvious concern in her voice after Sarah finished explaining the situation. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Sarah assured her. "It was scary, but I'm not hurt. The important thing is that those men won't be able to hurt anyone else for a while." Emma was quiet for a moment before responding. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You've always taught me to stand up for myself, and now I know where that strength comes from." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes at her daughter's words. After everything that had happened, Emma's support meant more to her than anything else. The drive from Arizona to Texas gave Sarah plenty of time to think about what had occurred. She realized that the confrontation had changed her in some ways. She felt more confident in her ability to protect herself, but also more aware of the dangers that existed on the road for women traveling alone. When Sarah arrived in Dallas the next morning to make her delivery, word of the incident had already spread through the trucking community. Truckers communicated constantly over CB radios and through social media, and stories of one of their own successfully defending herself against multiple attackers spread quickly. At the loading dock in Dallas, several other truck drivers approached Sarah to congratulate her and express their support. Many of them were men who had wives and daughters of their own, and they were proud that a female trucker had shown such courage in a dangerous situation. "You did good, Sarah," said Tom Bradley, a driver Sarah had known for several years. "Those guys picked the wrong trucker to mess with. Word is already getting around that messing with truckers ain't a smart idea." Over the following weeks, Sarah learned more about what had happened to her 3 attackers. Jake Morrison spent 2 weeks in the hospital with a severe concussion and required surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. He would eventually recover, but would face months of rehabilitation and permanent hearing loss in his left ear. Bobby Williams needed 23 stitches to close the cuts on his face from Sarah's keys. The scars would be permanent reminders of his poor decision to attack a trucker. Chris Thompson, being the youngest and most cooperative with police, received the lightest sentence but still faced serious legal consequences. During the investigation, police discovered that the 3 men had a history of targeting women at truck stops and rest areas throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Sarah's successful defense had likely prevented them from hurting many more victims in the future. The local news picked up the story, and Sarah found herself being interviewed by reporters who wanted to hear about the female trucker who had fought off 3 attackers. She was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but eventually decided to use the platform to encourage other women to learn self-defense and to trust their instincts when they felt threatened. "I don't consider myself a hero," Sarah told one reporter. "I was just a woman trying to get to her truck so she could do her job. But when someone threatens you and won't let you leave, you have to be prepared to defend yourself." The story inspired many other female truckers to share their own experiences with harassment and threats on the road. Sarah began receiving letters and emails from women across the country who thanked her for showing that they didn't have to be victims. 6 months later, Sarah was invited to speak at a trucking industry conference about safety for women drivers. She talked about the importance of situational awareness, basic self-defense training, and the need for the trucking community to look out for each other. Emma had started her freshman year at Arizona State University and was studying criminal justice. Partly inspired by her mother's experience, Mom showed me that women can be strong and protect themselves, Emma told her classmates. But she also showed me that sometimes the system fails people, and that's why we need good people working in law enforcement. Sarah continued driving trucks, but she made some changes to her routine. She took a more advanced self-defense course and always carried pepper spray in addition to her flashlight. She also became more selective about which truck stops she used. Avoiding places that seemed poorly lit or isolated, the incident had taught Sarah that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. But it had also reminded her that the world could be a dangerous place for women traveling alone. She never regretted defending herself that day in the Arizona truck stop, but she hoped she would never have to do it again. Years later, Sarah would learn that Jake Morrison had turned his life around after the incident. His head injury had given him seizures that made it impossible for him to drink alcohol, and the legal consequences had forced him to get his life together. He eventually wrote a letter of apology to Sarah, though she chose not to respond to it. Bobby Williams and Chris Thompson both served jail time and were required to attend counseling for their behavior. The incident had broken up their group and ended their pattern of targeting women. Sarah's story became something of a legend among truck drivers, particularly women in the industry. It served as proof that truckers took care of their own and that predators who targeted them did so at their own risk. But for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was that she had protected herself and possibly saved other women from becoming victims. She had shown that being outnumbered and outweighed didn't necessarily mean being helpless, and that sometimes the best defense was a strong offense. The desert sun had been brutal that day in Arizona, but Sarah Martinez had proven that she was even tougher.